hands, how many of you have ever felt sluggish, irritable, brain fog, like you have no energy to exercise or cook? What about that undeniable urge that just one more cup of coffee or one sugary treat is really going to turn things around? Yeah. Well, if that sounds familiar, you may have a food sensitivity. Not an allergy, that's something different, but a sensitivity. Turns out millions of Americans have food sensitivities, only they don't realize that's an actual thing, let alone what foods they might be sensitive to and what treatment to seek. So tonight, I want to show you how you can end your struggle with low energy, feel more youthful, just by removing foods that are wreaking havoc on your hormones and metabolism. Getting to the root of the problem can help your life, work, and relationships dramatically improve just from having restored vitality. Imagine if your energy levels could stay stable from the moment you woke up until you went to sleep at night. How much more patient would you be? Better able to handle stress, have more focus, get more productive, stay in the moment all day long. Just from making a few tweaks in what you eat. And I am not talking about going on a diet. Now I have a client, his name is Jack, we'll call him Jack. Jack came to me with a tangle of troubles. He was having trouble, he was feeling tired and anxious all the time, no matter how much sleep he got. Although that was problematic, he was often having trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. He also would wake up with a sore throat from snoring all night, and snoring wasn't something that Jack ever did before. He also described what he called the troubles, which was a seesaw of constipation and half-hour-long bathroom visits that used up a whole roll of toilet paper. Not very pretty. And after eating most meals, his stomach would blow up like he ate a basketball. So Jack went to the doctors, and what they found was inconclusive. He tested negative for food allergies. He didn't have Crohn's disease or celiac disease, which are two very severe digestive tract disorders. He was wondered if he might have colorectal cancer because he did have a family history of it, but he was negative there, so that's good. Sleep apnea test negative. So what was wrong with Jack? What was going on besides mounting frustration and medical bills? Unfortunately, conventional medicine tends to overlook food reactivity, aside from a few food allergies, even in the presence of chronic conditions. And as a health coach, I find this really curious because food is something that we put in our bodies constantly, and it's also the primary driver of so many chemical reactions that create energy. So why wouldn't it be suspect? Fortunately, Jack came to see me, and I sent him to get a food sensitivity test. That is a blood test that checks to see how your immune system responds to the presence of certain food proteins in your system. In other words, is your immune system going to attack food that you eat the same way it would a bacterial or viral invasion? And the results that came back for Jack were very surprising. His most reactive foods were bell peppers, oats, mustard, and gluten. Now, bell peppers and gluten were things that he ate every day, and mustard was his favorite condiment. So unfortunately, and unbeknownst to Jack, every time he ate these foods, he started to develop inflammation in his digestive tract. And when you have chronic inflammation, that leads to disease. So our first step was to eliminate the severe triggered foods from Jack's diet. When it comes to gluten, which is in everything, it was a little challenging, so we had to come up with replacements. And for instance, instead of bread, we switched him to a millet quinoa-based bread, and he stopped drinking beer, although there is gluten-free beer. We also had to deal with Jack's medium reactive foods, which were also a big surprise because they're otherwise healthy foods. Broccoli, mild and severe on his list. So we took them out of the diet for 3 months, and then after that period of time, started to reintroduce them with the condition that he couldn't have them more than 2 days in a row. And the results? Happy Jack. In less than 3 months, without adding any exercise or calorie restriction, Jack lost 15 pounds, started sleeping better, stopped snoring, and stopped having a bloated belly, and his energy levels, whoop, were back. Happy Jack. So what is a food sensitivity, and how is it different than an allergy? When you're allergic to a food and you eat it, your immune system reacts immediately to that food. Let's say it's shellfish. For example, you could have hives or a rash, or your throat swells shut. But with a food sensitivity, these are less studied than allergies, and partly because they're kind of difficult to diagnose. When you eat a food that you're sensitive to, there is a reaction that occurs, but it may not be noticeable to you for a few hours or even a few days after you eat that food. And if you're having a food every single day because it's your favorite food, it can have a cumulative effect in your body. And this is how so many people are walking around with food sensitivities and don't know it. They think it's normal to feel tired, or having chronic fatigue is just a part of a busy modern lifestyle. So what's really happening? When you eat a food that you're sensitive to, it is challenging to link the reaction back a couple of days. However, that reaction causes systemic inflammation in the body, which can lead to a whole host of symptoms, from fatigue, to brain fog, cravings, weight gain, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, and more. When we eat food that we're sensitive to, our bodies release histamines, which cause inflammation. Then our adrenal glands start pumping out a hormone called cortisol to manage the inflammation. However, when we're eating foods, lots of foods that are causing inflammation that we're sensitive to, or eating the same foods all of the time, our adrenal glands are really pumping to get the cortisol to try to manage this situation. And what happens with all of this work, your adrenals and you and me become chronically fatigued. And this is how we then, we also gain weight. And this is also how we feel fatigued, brain fog, and blah. Now, if we regularly consume these foods, what's happening, all of the energy that it takes to manage and try to combat all of the inflammatory effects is going to this situation instead of having energy for normal function. What's more, this kind of fatigue creates a vicious cycle, a roller coaster of highs and lows. Our bodies know instinctively that when we have low energy, we just have a little bit of sugar or starchy foods, we can get a boost, a quick boost of energy. And we experience this as a sugar high. But when we have a lot of sugar that comes into our bloodstream, our pancreas then secretes a hormone called insulin to get the sugar out of the blood into the cells to use for energy. But when we have too much sugar in the blood, our body sees this as an emergency and quickly tries to get all of the sugar out of the body as quickly as possible. We feel a sudden drop in our blood sugar and a sugar crash. Sound familiar? Anybody relate? This is also how we can become addicted to sugar. And I know because about 10 years ago, I was severely addicted to sugar because I used it for energy. Anytime I had low energy, I had sugar. I'd get high, and then I would crash. I needed more sugar to get back up. And everything I did was high on sugar. I was constantly hurting myself. I was a health enthusiast at the time. Anytime I'd exercise, I'd get hurt. Need more sugar to power through. It's a really ugly scenario. And this happens from the morning, first thing in the morning, all day long, until evening, and we repeat it over and over and over again. It's exhausting just thinking about how much food plays a role in our energy levels. Now, certain foods do play a role in inflammation more than others. Chief among them is gluten, but there's also corn, soy, and dairy. Gluten is a protein that is found in wheat and other grains. And the trouble with wheat, corn, and soy is that the reason why so many people have issues with them is that they tend to be loaded with pesticides and herbicides. They tend to be highly processed and genetically modified. Quick refresher, genetic modification is when we take the genes from food and breed it with pesticides or herbicides in a lab. These foods do not exist in nature. Suffice it to say, our bodies aren't used to having food-like substances and will react poorly to them. When it comes to gluten, Dr. Mark Hyman shares that not only do people have trouble processing gluten, but the wheat that Americans are eating today has a higher gluten content than wheat in its traditional form. So that's to say, not all wheat is bad, not all grains are bad. It's the way we're growing them here in the US. Unfortunately, GMOs have altered what a grain is. The trouble with corn is that it's also highly genetically modified. About 90% of corn grown in the US is genetically modified. And there's also a risk of cross-contamination with fungi due to farming practices. And fungi give off mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are the most abundant toxin in our nation's food. And we have soy, which is the second most widely grown crop in the US, which is also highly genetically modified. About 95% of all soy grown here is. And again, our bodies aren't designed to digest herbicides and pesticides, so we will have trouble with them. Surprise, surprise, right? Additionally, these crops, soy, corn, wheat, are commodity crops, which means that they are subsidized by the government, making them insanely cheap to produce. And American food companies love putting cheap ingredients in our food, which is not so great considering that almost all of the processed foods or processed things that we put in our mouths contain genetically modified ingredients. Everything from salad dressings to seasonings to candy to toothpaste. There's a theory going around the scientific community that that we're so overloaded with GMOs and they have overtaxed our digestive systems that we've become sensitive to the foods that contain them. And I argue also to the foods that we are consuming along with them. Another common sensitivity is to casein, which is a protein found in dairy products. This is different than lactose intolerance, which is when you lack the enzyme to break down the lactose molecule. But casein is a slow digesting protein that can gum up our small intestines. And so to put it in perspective, human breast milk has about 20% casein, cow's milk has 80%. Gluten sensitivity and dairy sensitivity are often linked in leaky gut conditions. And a leaky gut is when the intestinal wall of your small intestine becomes so inflamed that proteins are able to poke holes in them, and undigested food particles end up leaking into the bloodstream where they do not belong, which sends off alarms in our immune system where they have to launch a full-on attack on these UFOs, which is actually food, otherwise healthy food. A recent study in the European Journal of Nutrition had real evidence that casein might be the cause of gut inflammation. Now keep in mind, cow's milk is designed to grow a baby cow who has 2 stomachs from 70 pounds to 1,000 pounds in 15 months. Human growth hormone don't work like that, thankfully. Now, there are 2 ways to determine if you have a food sensitivity. One would be doing a food sensitivity test, like we sent Jack. It's called an IgG antibody test. And the second way, which is kind of a step 2, would be doing an elimination and challenge diet. This is where we remove all of the trigger foods for a period of time, usually a minimum of 3 weeks. And during that window, we want to notice any changes that the client is experiencing. So a lot of my clients will experience a clearer brain, skin starts to clear up, less bloating, weight loss, more energy. And then after this phase, we one by one start introducing foods back into the diet and noticing if any of the symptoms crop back up. Would you like to know any substitutes that you can implement now?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow.
All right, glad you asked. Instead of cow's milk or soy milk, try coconut milk. And if that flavor doesn't float your boat, try flax or almond or even cashew milk, even of hemp milk, turmeric milk. In place of pasta, try zoodles made from zucchini, or rice pasta, quinoa pasta, bean pasta. In place of corn-based or wheat-based cereals, try millet or gluten-free steel-cut oats. And if you want a meat substitute, instead of tofu, I recommend, if you do eat meat, organic grass-fed meat, or stick with beans or mushrooms are a great substitute for meat. I know that I've kind of covered a lot in a short period of time, and you may have a lot of questions, and that's okay, it's totally normal, because when I work with people one-on-one, we really dive deep, and it's a much more comprehensive process than this overview tonight. But I hope that I've given you some food for thought, and invite you to get curious about how food really can change things around.